The fluorescent lights of the pre-operative waiting room buzzed with the same relentless rhythm as the machines that would soon monitor my heartbeat. I sat alone in the thin hospital gown, my fingers trembling not from the cold air conditioning, but from the empty chair beside me where my mother should have been sitting. The clipboard in my times in the past hour. Emergency contact. Margaret Chen, attorney at law. Not Mom. Not anymore. The surgical scheduler, a woman named Patricia, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had noticed my hesitation when she'd collected the forms. "Are you sure about this contact information, honey? Usually we have family members listed." I'd nodded, my throat too tight to explain that family doesn't always mean what it should mean. That sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones who leave you bleeding alone in hospital corridors, while they applaud someone else's dreams under stage lights. My phone buzzed against my thigh. A text from my younger sister, Emma. "Break a leg tonight. Oh, wait, you already did that. Wish you could see my solo." The irony wasn't lost on me. I had broken my leg. Shattered it, actually, in 3 places 6 weeks ago while trying to fix the loose railing on our front porch. The same railing I'd been asking Dad to repair for months before he moved out. The same railing Mom kept saying she'd get to eventually between Emma's dance practices, Emma's costume fittings, Emma's everything. I'd been carrying groceries up those front steps when the railing gave way. The snap of breaking wood had been nothing compared to the sound my tibia made when it hit the concrete. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door had found me there 20 minutes later, grocery bags scattered around me like confetti at a party nobody wanted to attend. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the infection that had set in 2 weeks later, turning what should have been a simple healing process into something that required emergency surgery. The kind of surgery that couldn't wait for convenient scheduling, that couldn't be postponed for dance recitals or piano lessons or whatever other shiny distraction was currently occupying my mother's attention. "Maya Chen?" A nurse appeared at the doorway, her scrubs decorated with tiny cartoon cats that seemed inappropriate for the gravity of the situation. "We're ready for you, sweetheart." I stood carefully, the crutches I'd become so familiar with clicking against the linoleum floor. Behind me, I could hear other families murmuring their goodbyes. Mothers kissing foreheads, fathers squeezing hands. The sounds of normal love, normal support. Normal families who showed up when it mattered. "Is anyone here with you?" the nurse asked, glancing around the empty waiting room section where I'd been sitting. "My lawyer is on her way," I said, and the words tasted strange in my mouth. True, but strange. Margaret Chen, no relation, despite sharing my last name, had been handling my parents' divorce paperwork for the past 8 months. She'd become something like a friend during those long meetings where we'd discussed asset division and custody arrangements. She's the one who'd explained to me, in careful legal terms, that at 17, I had more rights than I'd realized, that I could make my own medical decisions, that I could choose who stood beside me when those decisions mattered most. She was also the one who'd looked genuinely shocked when I'd called her yesterday from the hospital bed, asking if she'd be willing to serve as my emergency contact. "Maya," she'd said, her voice soft over the phone connection, "where is your mother?" "At Emma's dress rehearsal," I'd answered. "The spring recital is tomorrow night. She can't miss it. She's the room mom for the dance company, and Emma has a solo, and apparently that's more important than—" I'd stopped myself then, the words backing up in my throat like water behind a dam. Margaret had been quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'll be there." Now, as I followed the nurse down the corridor toward the operating room, I tried not to think about what Mom was doing at this exact moment. Probably helping Emma with her hair, pinning rhinestones to her costume, making sure every detail was perfect for tomorrow night's performance. The performance that was apparently so crucial that she couldn't reschedule, couldn't ask another parent to help, couldn't find any way to be in 2 places at once. Your friend called about 20 minutes ago, the nurse was saying as we walked. Miss Chen? She's stuck in traffic but should be here within the hour. Dr. Peterson said he could wait a little longer if you'd like. I shook my head. Let's just get this over with. The pre-operative area was a maze of curtained cubicles, each containing someone else's medical crisis, someone else's fear. I could hear fragments of conversation, a woman crying about her husband's heart condition, an elderly man joking with his grandson about hospital food, a teenage boy arguing with his parents about missing school. Normal families, normal problems, normal love. My cubicle was at the end of the row, quieter than the others. The nurse, her name tag read Jennifer, helped me onto the narrow bed and began the ritual of medical preparation. Blood pressure cuff, temperature probe, IV line in my left arm. Each procedure performed with practiced efficiency and gentle commentary. "You're very mature for 17, Jennifer observed as she adjusted the IV drip. "Most kids your age are crying for their moms by now." "My mom is busy," I said simply. Jennifer paused in her work, studying my face with the kind of professional assessment that healthcare workers develop after years of seeing human nature at its best and worst. "Busy with what, if you don't mind me asking?" "My sister's dance recital." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken questions. Jennifer returned to her tasks, but I could feel her thinking, processing, probably wondering what kind of mother chooses a dance recital over her child's emergency surgery. The same kind of mother who'd missed my high school graduation because Emma had a dance competition in another state. The same kind of mother who'd forgotten my birthday last year because it fell on the same weekend as Emma's intensive workshop with some famous choreographer. The same kind of motherhood somehow convinced herself that love could be rationed, that attention was a finite resource that had to be carefully allocated to whoever needed it most at any given moment. And Emma always needed it most. Don't get me wrong, I loved my sister. Despite everything, despite the years of feeling invisible in my own home, despite watching my mother's face light up in ways it never did for me, I loved Emma. She was talented and beautiful and deserving of support, but so was I. At least, I thought I was. The curtain rustled and Dr. Peterson appeared, already dressed in surgical scrubs. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of earnest demeanor that suggested he still believed medicine could fix everything that was broken in the world. "Maya," he said, pulling up a small stool beside my bed. "How are you feeling?" "Ready to get this infection taken care of," I answered. "Good. That's exactly the attitude we like to see." He pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what I assumed was my medical chart. "Now, I know we discussed the procedure yesterday, but I want to go over everything one more time. The infection in your tibia has created some complications, and we need to clean out the affected area and possibly place some antibiotic beads to help with the healing process." I nodded, trying to focus on his words instead of the empty chair beside my bed. "The good news is that we caught this early enough that there shouldn't be any long-term complications. The bad news is that recovery is going to take longer than we initially hoped. We're looking at another 6 to 8 weeks of limited mobility, possibly more physical therapy." 6 to 8 more weeks of needing help with basic tasks? 6 to 8 more weeks of being dependent on a mother who'd already made it clear where her priorities lay. "I understand," I said. Dr. Peterson glanced around the cubicle. "Is your family here yet? I usually like to speak with parents before we begin." "My emergency contact is on her way," I said, for the second time that day. "Margaret Chen, she's my lawyer." If Dr. Peterson found this unusual, he didn't show it. Doctors, I was learning, developed the same professional poker face as nurses when it came to family dynamics that didn't fit the expected mold. "All right, then. Any other questions before we get started?" I had 1,000 questions, but none that he could answer. Questions like, how do you repair a relationship that's been broken longer than any bone? How do you heal from the kind of wound that doesn't show up on x-rays? How do you learn to trust that someone will be there when you need them most, when everyone who's supposed to love you keeps proving they won't? "No questions," I said instead. Dr. Peterson stood to leave, then paused. "Maya, I want you to know that what you're doing, advocating for yourself, making your own medical decisions, ensuring you have support from someone you trust, That takes courage. Not every 17-year-old would handle this situation with such maturity. After he left, I lay back against the thin hospital pillows and stared at the ceiling tiles. Somewhere across town, my mother was probably fussing over Emma's makeup, adjusting her costume straps, taking a dozen photos to post on social media. The proud dance mom, living vicariously through her daughter's achievements, basking in reflected glory. I wondered if she'd even thought about me since I'd told her about the surgery. The conversation had happened 3 days ago, over breakfast. Emma had been practicing her routine in the living room, her point shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, while Mom sat at the kitchen table addressing envelopes for recital invitations. "The doctor called," I'd said, setting down my orange juice. "The infection is worse than they thought. I need surgery on Friday." Mom had looked up from her envelope addressing, her pen still poised in her hand. For a moment, I'd seen something flicker across her face. Concern, maybe, or guilt. But then Emma had stumbled in her routine, and Mom's attention had immediately shifted. "Did you hurt yourself, sweetheart?" she'd called out, already halfway out of her chair. "I'm fine, Mom, just got distracted." When Mom had returned to the table, that flicker of concern for me had disappeared completely. "Friday?" she'd said, as if she were trying to remember what day that was. "Oh, Maya, that's the night of Emma's recital. Can't you reschedule?" Reschedule emergency surgery? As if bacteria operated on convenient timelines, as if bacteria cared about dance performances. "It's emergency surgery, Mom. You can't reschedule emergencies." "Well, surely it can wait until Saturday. Emma has been working toward this recital all year. She has a solo, and I'm the room mom. I can't just abandon my responsibilities." "Your responsibilities." The words had echoed in my head for 3 days now. Apparently, her responsibilities extended to every member of Emma's dance company, but not to her own daughter's medical needs. "I'll figure something else out," I'd said finally, and Mom had smiled with relief. "I knew you'd understand. Emma's success is so important for her college applications. This recital could really open doors for her." "And what about my doors?" I had wanted to ask. "What about my future? My college applications? My success? What about the fact that I'd maintained a 4.0 GPA while working 20 hours a week at the local library to save money for college, while Emma's only responsibility was perfecting her grand jetés?" But I'd said nothing. I'd learned years ago that voicing these thoughts only led to lectures about supporting family members and not being selfish. Better to stay quiet and figure out my own solutions. Which is how I'd ended up calling Margaret Chen. The curtain rustled again, and Jennifer returned with a warm blanket. "Your lawyer just called," she said, tucking the blanket around my shoulders. "She's about 10 minutes away. Traffic was worse than expected, but she wanted you to know she's coming." "Thank you." She also wanted me to tell you that she's proud of you, for advocating for yourself, for making sure you have someone here who cares about what happens to you. The words hit me unexpectedly hard, bringing tears to my eyes that I quickly blinked away. When was the last time someone had said they were proud of me? When was the last time anyone had acknowledged that I was capable of advocating for myself, of making difficult decisions, of handling adult responsibilities with grace? Certainly not my mother, who still treated me like a child when it was convenient and expected me to handle everything alone when it wasn't. "She sounds like a good friend," Jennifer observed. "She is," I said, and realized it was true. Margaret had become more than just my parents' divorce attorney. She'd become someone I could trust, someone who showed up when she said she would, someone who saw me as a whole person rather than just an obstacle to someone else's dreams. My phone buzzed again. Another text. This one from Mom. "Hope everything goes well today, sweetie. I'll check on you tonight after the recital. Emma sends her love." Emma sends her love. As if Emma even knew what was happening today. As if anyone in my family was actually thinking about me right now. I turned the phone face down on the bedside table and closed my eyes. In a few minutes, Margaret would arrive, and she'd sit in that empty chair, and she'd hold my hand if I needed her to, and she'd be there when I woke up from surgery with questions about what happened and what came next. She'd do all the things a mother should do, even though she had no biological obligation to care about my well-being. And somewhere across town, my actual mother would be pinning rhinestones and taking photos and posting updates about her amazing daughter for all her friends to see. Just not me. Never me. The anesthesiologist arrived as I was drifting into these dark thoughts, a cheerful woman named Dr. Kumar, who explained the process of going under and assured me that I'd wake up feeling much better. She asked about allergies and previous reactions to medication, all the standard questions that responsible adults ask before putting someone else's life in their hands. "Any anxiety about the procedure?" she asked. "No," I said. "I trust you." It was easier to trust strangers who were honest about their intentions than to trust family members who made promises they had no intention of keeping. Just as Dr. Kumar was preparing the anesthesia, the curtain opened one final time and Margaret Chen rushed in. She was still wearing her business suit from whatever client meeting she'd left early, her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled from hurrying through hospital corridors. "Maya," she said, immediately taking the empty chair beside my bed, "I'm so sorry I'm late. How are you feeling?" Looking at her face, genuinely concerned, slightly out of breath from rushing to be here, I felt something inside my chest loosen slightly. This was what it felt like to have someone prioritize your well-being. This was what it looked like when an adult took responsibility seriously. "I'm okay," I said. "Better now that you're here." Margaret squeezed my hand. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." And just before the anesthesia pulled me under, I thought about how strange it was that a woman I'd known for 8 months could make me feel more cared for than the woman who'd given birth to me. How a lawyer doing her job could show more maternal instinct than my actual mother. The last thing I remembered was Margaret's voice, steady and reassuring, telling me she'd be right here when I woke up. A promise I actually believed she'd keep. Margaret seemed to understand. "I called your mother about an hour ago to let her know you were out of surgery and doing well. She was relieved to hear it." Relieved, but not relieved enough to leave the recital early, not concerned enough to choose differently. The familiar sting of disappointment settled in my chest, as predictable and unwelcome as the pain in my leg. "What were you reading?" I asked, wanting to change the subject. Margaret held up the small book. "Maya Angelou. I thought you might appreciate sharing a name with such an incredible writer." I almost smiled. In all my 17 years, no one had ever made that connection before. My parents had chosen the name because they liked how it sounded, not because of any literary significance. Trust Margaret to find meaning where my own family had seen only syllables. "Could you read more?" For the next hour, Margaret read poetry while I drifted in and out of consciousness. Her voice was steady and soothing, nothing like Mom's tendency to fill silence with anxious chatter about Emma's activities or Dad's latest failings. When I was awake, I listened to words about resilience and strength and rising above circumstances. When I dozed, I dreamed about being someone worth reading to. Around midnight, a different nurse, the night shift staff, came in to check my vitals and offer pain medication. She was older than Jennifer, with graying hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen it all. "Visiting hours officially ended 2 hours ago," she informed Margaret, "but I'll make an exception. You're the first emergency contact I've ever met who actually showed up and stayed." After she left, Margaret and I sat in comfortable silence. The hospital had grown quieter, the daytime urgency replaced by the slower rhythm of overnight monitoring. Through the window, I could see the city lights, people going about their evening routines, returning home to families who probably functioned the way families were supposed to function. "Margaret," I said eventually, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you were my age, did you ever feel like you were invisible in your own family?" She set down her book and looked at me carefully. "What do you mean?" "Like, Everyone talks about supporting each other and being there for family, but somehow you're always the one doing the supporting and never the one being supported. Like, your problems are always less important than everyone else's problems. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. My parents divorced when I was 16, she said finally. My mother was so focused on her own heartbreak, and my father was so focused on his new girlfriend, that neither of them noticed I was failing chemistry and had developed an eating disorder. I learned to handle everything on my own because there really wasn't another choice. Is that why you became a lawyer? Partly. I wanted to help people navigate systems that seemed designed to overlook them, and I wanted to make sure I'd never be financially dependent on anyone who might decide I wasn't worth supporting. I understood that completely. For the past 2 years, I'd been working at the library partly to save money for college, but mostly to ensure I'd never be in a position where I had to beg for basic necessities, where I'd have to compete with my sister for resources and attention and lose every single time.
Your mother loves you, Margaret said gently. I can see it when she talks about you. But love and prioritizing aren't always the same thing. She loves the idea of me, I corrected. She loves having a responsible daughter who doesn't require much attention, who handles things on her own, who makes her life easier instead of more complicated. She doesn't actually love me, the real person with real needs and feelings. Margaret didn't try to argue with this assessment, which I appreciated. She didn't offer platitudes about how all mothers love their children or how I should be more understanding of my mother's situation. She just listened, the way adults should listen to teenagers but rarely do. My phone, which had been silent for hours, suddenly buzzed with a text message. Both Margaret and I looked at it, lying there on the bedside table like a small explosive device. You don't have to look at it, Margaret said. But I did look. I had to know. After she left, promising to return in the morning to help with my discharge, I lay awake thinking about that concept. How much of who I'd become was really my personality, and how much was just adaptation to circumstances? If I'd grown up in a family where attention wasn't a competition, where love wasn't rationed, where my needs mattered as much as everyone else's needs, would I be the same person? The night nurse came in every few hours to check on me, offering pain medication and adjusting my position. Each time, she asked if I needed anything, if I was comfortable, if there was anyone she could call. Basic caring behaviors that felt almost foreign in their consistency. Around 4 in the morning, unable to sleep despite the pain medication, I found myself thinking about Emma. Not with resentment exactly, but with a kind of analytical curiosity. She was 15, 2 years younger, and she'd grown up in the same house with the same parents. But her experience had been completely different. Emma had learned that love meant constant attention, constant praise, constant support for her interests and goals. She expected adults to rearrange their schedules for her needs, to prioritize her activities, to celebrate her achievements with enthusiasm and pride. These expectations weren't unreasonable, they were actually completely normal for how children should be treated. The difference was that Emma got what she expected, while I'd learned not to expect anything at all. I wondered if she even realized how differently we were treated, if she noticed that Mom missed my events but never missed hers, that Mom talked about her accomplishments to friends but rarely mentioned mine, that Mom's entire social media presence revolved around Emma's dance career while I was barely visible in family photos. Probably not. When you're the golden child, the favored one, the center of attention, it must feel natural and normal. It would be like asking a fish to notice water. The environment is so consistent and all-encompassing that it becomes invisible. But from the outside, the disparity was stark and painful and impossible to ignore. By the time morning arrived, I had made a decision that surprised even me in its clarity and resolve. When I got home, I was going to have a conversation with my mother. Not an argument, not an emotional confrontation, but a calm, honest discussion about how her choices had affected me, about what I needed from her going forward, about what would happen if those needs continued to be ignored. I didn't know if it would change anything. Probably it wouldn't. People rarely fundamentally alter their behavior patterns just because someone points out the harm they've caused. But I needed to try, if only for my own sense of self-respect. And if nothing changed, which seemed likely, at least I'd know I'd advocated for myself. At least I'd spoken up instead of suffering in silence. At least I'd treated myself with the respect that no one else seemed capable of showing. The morning nurse came in with a cheerful woman named Sandra, who helped me get ready for discharge. Margaret arrived at 10 o'clock with a change of clothes for my house and an update on my mother's plans. She'll pick you up at noon. She wanted to take Emma out for a celebratory brunch first. Apparently, several talent scouts were at the recital last night. Of course, Emma's success took precedence even over my hospital discharge. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed in myself for still hoping things might be different. "I'll drive you home myself," Margaret offered. "Your mother can meet us there."
I accepted gratefully, relieved to avoid the awkward car ride where Mom would probably spend the entire time talking about how amazing Emma had been the night before, while I sat there with fresh surgical stitches, trying to pretend I didn't care about being secondary in my own medical crisis. Dr. Peterson stopped by before my discharge to check the surgical site and review recovery instructions. Everything looked good, he said. The infection was completely cleared, and I should heal normally as long as I followed the prescribed physical therapy routine and kept the incision clean. "You did great, Maya," he said as he signed my discharge papers. Not every 17-year-old could handle this situation with such maturity and grace. The same thing multiple people had said to me over the past 24 hours. It was meant as a compliment, I knew, but it also felt like a kind of indictment. Why was I so mature for my age? Why was I capable of handling adult situations that should have been handled by actual adults? Why was I managing my own medical crisis while my mother managed my sister's dance career? Margaret helped me navigate the discharge process, making sure I understood my medication schedule and follow-up appointments. She'd printed out all the information and organized it in a folder, the kind of detailed preparation that demonstrated actual caring about outcomes, actual investment in my well-being. As we left the hospital, I found myself looking back at the building where I'd spent the night. It had been one of the most difficult 24 hours of my life, but also one of the most clarifying. I'd learned that I could advocate for myself, that I could make difficult decisions, that I could survive without my family's support because I'd essentially been surviving without it for years. I'd also learned what it felt like to have someone truly prioritize my needs, to show up when they said they would, to treat my well-being as important. Margaret had given me a gift more valuable than any medical care. She'd shown me what I deserved, what I should expect from the people who claimed to love me. Now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The first thing I noticed when Margaret pulled into our driveway was Emma's dance bag sitting by the front door, still packed with the rhinestone costume from the night before. The second thing I noticed was Mom's car wasn't there yet. "She's probably stuck in traffic," Margaret said diplomatically, as she helped me out of her sedan. "Weekend brunch crowds can be unpredictable." But I knew better. Mom was probably extending Emma's celebration, stopping by the dance studio so Emma could show off her flowers to other dancers, or maybe visiting Grandma Ruth so Emma could perform her solo in the living room for an encore audience. The same Grandma Ruth who asked about me maybe twice a year, but who could recite every detail of Emma's dance competitions going back 5 years. Margaret helped me navigate the front steps, carefully avoiding the still broken railing that caused this whole mess in the first place, and waited while I fumbled with my keys. The house felt different when I walked in, though nothing had visibly changed. Maybe it was just the contrast between the hospital's institutional efficiency and our home's comfortable chaos.
Or maybe it was seeing my family environment through the eyes of someone who'd witnessed my mother's priorities in action. "Would you like something to drink?" I offered, though moving around the kitchen with crutches felt clumsy and exhausting. "I'll get it," Margaret said. "You need to rest. Doctor's orders."
She found glasses and ice with the kind of practical competence that I associated with actual adults, not the performative helplessness that Mom often displayed when asked to handle anything outside her comfort zone. As she moved around our kitchen, I found myself seeing it through her eyes. Emma's dance trophies covering every surface, Emma's photos from various performances papering the refrigerator, Emma's schedule dominating the family calendar on the wall. There was one photo of me on the refrigerator, from last year's honor roll ceremony, tucked behind a grocery list and almost completely obscured by Emma's most recent competition headshot. "You have a lovely home," Margaret said, setting a glass of water beside me on the couch. "Emma has a lovely shrine," I corrected. "I just happen to live in it." Margaret followed my gaze around the living room, taking in the visual evidence of our family's priorities. To her credit, she didn't offer empty reassurances or try to find examples of equal treatment. She just observed, processing the information the same way she probably processed evidence in her legal cases. We'd been sitting in comfortable silence for about 20 minutes when I heard Mom's car in the driveway, followed by the sound of Emma's voice, high and excited, recounting what must have been the 10th retelling of her performance from the night before. And then in the second variation, when I did the tour de taste sequence, I could see the judges actually leaning forward in their seats. Mrs. Patterson said she's never seen a dancer my age with such natural stage presence. The front door opened, and Emma practically bounced into the living room, still glowing with the aftermath of successful performance. She was wearing a "Dance Like Nobody's Watching" t-shirt and carrying a bouquet of flowers that was probably bigger than the one I'd receive at my high school graduation. "Maya!" She threw her arms around me in an enthusiastic hug that jarred my surgical site. "How was your surgery? Did everything go okay? Mom said you were really brave." Before I could answer, Mom appeared in the doorway, looking slightly frazzled but fundamentally pleased with herself. She was carrying 2 coffee cups and a bakery box that probably contained celebratory pastries. "Maya, sweetheart," she said, setting down her armload of treats and giving me a brief, careful hug. "I'm so glad you're home. How are you feeling?" "Tired," I said honestly, "but okay." "This is Margaret Chen," I added, gesturing toward my emergency contact, who had stood politely when my family arrived. Mom's demeanor shifted slightly when she realized there was a witness to this reunion. Her smile became more performative, her concern more theatrical. "Ms. Chen, thank you so much for staying with Maya yesterday. I can't tell you how much it means to know she wasn't alone." Mom's voice carried that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound like Mother of the Year for public consumption. "It was my pleasure," Margaret replied evenly. "Maya handled everything with remarkable maturity." "Oh, she's always been so responsible," Mom said, settling into her favorite armchair, the one with the best view of Emma's trophy collection. "Even as a little girl, she never needed much attention. So independent." The words stung in their casual dismissal. Never needed much attention, as if my self-sufficiency had been a choice rather than a survival adaptation, as if I'd somehow been born knowing how to handle disappointment and neglect with grace. Emma had already started unpacking her dance bag, spreading rhinestone-covered costume pieces across the coffee table like artifacts from a successful expedition. "Maya, you should have seen the other dancers' faces when I nailed the fouette sequence. Some of them have been working on those turns for years, and I got them on my second try." "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it despite everything. Emma's talent was real, and her joy was infectious. It wasn't her fault that our mother had decided love was a zero-sum game. "Tell her about the talent scout," Mom prompted, pulling out her phone to scroll through what I assumed were videos from the night before. "Oh my God, yes! There were 3 talent scouts there last night, and one of them gave Mrs. Patterson her card specifically for me. She said I have exceptional natural ability and that she wants to see me audition for the summer intensive program at the Metropolitan Ballet Academy." Margaret listened politely to this recitation, occasionally making appropriate sounds of congratulation, but I could see her observing the family dynamic with professional interest. How Emma commanded the entire room's attention without effort, how Mom's face lit up with vicarious pride, how I became background noise in my own living room. "That's a significant opportunity," Margaret said when Emma paused for breath. "You must have worked very hard to reach this level. I practice 6 hours a day during the school year, 8 during breaks. We're basically living in the car." Mom laughed indulgently. "It's worth every minute. Emma's gifts are so rare, we have to nurture them properly." We have to nurture them. Not Emma has gifts that she's working hard to develop, not Emma deserves support like any child pursuing their passions. Emma's gifts needed nurturing, which apparently required the entire family's resources and attention. "What about you, Maya?" Margaret asked, turning toward me with deliberate inclusion. "What are your interests? What are you passionate about?" The question hung in the air like a foreign language. When was the last time someone had asked me about my passions? When was the last time anyone had shown curiosity about my inner life? "I like writing," I said hesitantly, "and reading. I work at the library, so I get to discover new books all the time." "Maya's very academic," Mom added, in the tone people use to describe vegetables that are good for you but not particularly exciting. "She's always got her nose in a book." "What kind of writing do you do?" Margaret pressed, ignoring Mom's dismissive summary. "Short stories, mostly. Some poetry. I edit the school literary magazine, and I had a piece published in the state anthology last year." Margaret's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "That's incredible. Publication at your age is quite an achievement." Emma looked confused, as if she'd never heard about this before. Which, come to think of it, she probably hadn't. "You never told me you got published." "I mentioned it at dinner when the acceptance letter came," I said carefully. "But you were in Tech Week for Swan Lake, so there was a lot going on." What I didn't say was that Mom had responded to my news with a distracted, "That's nice, honey," before immediately returning to the crisis of Emma's costume alterations. What I didn't say was that my achievement had been overshadowed by Emma's performance anxiety and completely forgotten within minutes. "That's wonderful," Mom said now, though her tone suggested she was hearing about it for the first time. "We should put that acceptance letter on the refrigerator." Except we shouldn't, because it had been on the refrigerator for 4 months before being gradually buried under Emma's more recent accomplishments. I'd taken it down myself last week when I realized no one was looking at it anyway. "Do you want to pursue writing professionally?" Margaret asked. Before I could answer, Mom jumped in. "Oh, writing is such an uncertain career path. We've always encouraged Maya to focus on more practical subjects. She's planning to major in business administration." I stared at my mother, feeling something cold and hard settle in my stomach. "Actually, I'm planning to major in English with a journalism concentration." Mom's smile faltered slightly. "Since when?" "Since I submitted my course selection forms 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken tensions. Emma looked back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match, while Margaret observed with the neutral expression of someone who dealt with family conflict professionally. "Well," Mom said finally, "we can discuss your major later. The important thing is that you're feeling better after your surgery." But I wasn't feeling better. If anything, I was feeling worse with each passing minute, sitting in my own living room, surrounded by evidence of my sister's importance and my own invisibility, listening to my mother casually dismiss my academic choices and career aspirations. It was like death by 1,000 paper cuts. "Actually, I think we should discuss it now." Mom blinked, clearly taken aback by my directness. "Maya, you're recovering from surgery. This isn't the time for
This is exactly the time, because I just spent 24 hours in the hospital, and the only person who showed up for me was someone I've known for 8 months. My own mother chose a dance recital over my emergency surgery. The words came out louder than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. Emma's eyes widened, and she looked toward Mom as if expecting her to dispute this characterization. Maya, that's not fair, Mom said, her voice taking on that wounded tone she used when anyone questioned her parenting choices. Emma's recital was incredibly important. She's been working toward it all year, and there were talent scouts there. I couldn't just abandon her at such a crucial moment. But you could abandon me? You had Miss Chen with you. You were in good hands. That's not the point. The words exploded out of me with a force that made everyone in the room flinch. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, probably wondering if she should leave, but I was grateful for her presence. Having a witness made this conversation feel more real, more legitimate, harder for Mom to dismiss or reframe later. That's simply not true, Mom said, but her protest lacked conviction. I love both my daughters equally. Love and attention aren't the same thing, I said, unconsciously echoing Margaret's words from the night before. When was the last time you came to one of my literary magazine meetings? When was the last time you posted about my academic achievements on social media? When was the last time you rearranged your schedule for something I needed? Emma was looking increasingly uncomfortable, probably realizing for the first time that these disparities existed. Maya, I didn't know you.
It's not your fault, I told her quickly. You haven't done anything wrong. This isn't about you. But Mom was rallying her defenses. Maya, I think you're being overly emotional because of the surgery. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, I said. And here's what I figured out. I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want to be the invisible daughter, the one who gets the leftovers of your attention after Emma gets everything else. You're being dramatic. Am I? Let's test that theory. I reached for my phone, pulling up my mother's Facebook profile. When was the last post you made about me? I scrolled through months of Emma's dance photos, Emma's performance videos, Emma's award ceremonies. Mom leaned forward to look at the screen, and I watched her face change as she realized what the evidence showed. February 14th, I said, finding the post I was looking for. A Valentine's Day photo of the whole family at dinner. And before that, let's see, my birthday post from last year. 2 mentions in the past year, and one of them was obligatory birthday wishes. I switched to Emma's social media presence. Emma has been mentioned 47 times since January 1st. 47 posts about her achievements, her performances, her future opportunities. Her daily life is documented like she's a celebrity. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. Emma was staring at my phone screen, probably seeing the disparity for the first time in concrete terms. Social media isn't everything, Mom said weakly. You're right, it's not. But it's a pretty clear indicator of what you think is worth celebrating, worth sharing, worth being proud of. Margaret cleared her throat gently. Perhaps I should give you all some privacy to discuss this as a family? No, I said quickly. Please stay. I need someone here who isn't emotionally invested in protecting the status quo. Mom's face flushed with embarrassment or anger, probably both. Maya, this is a private family matter. There's nothing private about it. Everyone who knows us can see exactly how this family operates. The neighbors know, my teachers know, your friends know. The only person who seemed surprised by any of this was Emma. Emma looked stricken. Maya, I really didn't realize. I know you didn't, and I'm not angry with you, but I am angry with Mom, and I think I have the right to be. Of course you have the right to be angry, Margaret said carefully. Feeling overlooked or undervalued in your own family would be painful for anyone. Mom turned toward Margaret with barely concealed hostility.
With all due respect, Ms. Chen, you don't understand the complexities of raising two very different children with two very different needs. You're absolutely right. I don't have children of my own, but I do understand family systems, and I can observe patterns of behavior objectively. And what patterns do you observe? I asked, genuinely curious about her professional assessment.
Margaret hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being drawn into a family therapy role. I observe that Maya has learned to be extremely self-sufficient, which suggests she's had to be. I observe that Emma receives a great deal of external validation and support, which suggests she's learned to expect it. And I observe that your mother seems genuinely surprised by Maya's feelings, which suggests there may be some communication gaps in how needs are expressed and received. It was a diplomatically worded summary, but it captured the essential dynamics perfectly. Emma received support because she expected it. I didn't receive support because I'd learned not to expect it, and Mom remained oblivious to the impact of her choices because no one had ever forced her to confront them directly. "So what do you want me to do?" Mom asked, and there was something almost helpless in her voice. Emma's career requires intensive support. She has real talent, real opportunities. I can't just ignore her needs. "I'm not asking you to ignore Emma's needs," I said. "I'm asking you to recognize that I have needs too." "What needs? You're so independent, so capable of handling everything on your own." "Because I had to be." The words came out as a shout, and I immediately lowered my voice, aware that we had neighbors. "I learned to be independent because depending on you meant being disappointed. I learned to handle things on my own because asking for help meant being told that other things were more important." Emma was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. "Maya, I never wanted you to feel like you didn't matter." "I know you didn't, but feeling like I don't matter has been my reality for years." Mom stood up abruptly, pacing toward the window and back. "I don't know how to fix this. Emma's career opportunities are time-sensitive. Her talent window is narrow. If we don't support her career now while she's young, she might miss her chance entirely." "And what about my chances? What about my opportunities? What about the fact that I've been working my ass off academically while also working 20 hours a week to save for college, while Emma's only responsibility is showing up to classes that you pay for and drive her to? Your education is important too. Then act like it. Come to my literary magazine readings. Ask about my college applications. Show some interest in my writing beyond calling it impractical. Post about my achievements on social media. Treat my successes like they matter. They do matter. Prove it." The challenge hung between us like a gauntlet thrown down. Mom opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, clearly struggling with how to demonstrate care that hadn't been consistently shown. Emma spoke into the silence. "Mom, maybe I could skip some of my classes this summer if the intensive program is too expensive or it takes up too much time." "Absolutely not," Mom and I said simultaneously. "This isn't about money or time," I continued. "This is about priorities and attention and making your children feel valued. Emma, you deserve every opportunity you're getting. You've worked hard and you're talented and you should be supported. But I deserve support too." "So what does that look like?" Mom asked, and for the first time in this conversation, she sounded genuinely curious rather than defensive. I had been thinking about this question all night in the hospital, preparing for this moment. "It looks like you showing up when I need you, even if it's inconvenient. It looks like celebrating my achievements with the same enthusiasm you show for Emma's. It looks like asking about my life, my interests, my goals, and actually listening to the answers. And it looks like treating my medical emergencies like they're more important than dance recitals," I added. Mom flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Maya, I had no idea your surgery was going to be such a big deal." "It was emergency surgery to treat a bone infection. How was that not a big deal?" "I thought it was routine." "You thought it was routine because you didn't ask questions.
You didn't want to know the details because knowing the details might have made it harder to choose Emma's recital. The accusation hung in the air, and I watched Mom's face cycle through denial, defensiveness, and finally, reluctant recognition. "You're right," she said quietly. "I should have asked more questions. I should have taken it more seriously." It was a small admission, but it felt like a crack in a dam, the first acknowledgement that her choices had been wrong, not just misunderstood. "I want to be a better mother to you," she continued. "I just don't know how to balance everything. Emma's needs are so immediate, so visible, because you've trained her to expect immediate responses to her needs, and you've trained Maya to minimize her needs to avoid being a burden. Those patterns can be changed, but it requires conscious effort from everyone." Emma wiped her eyes and looked at me with something that might have been admiration. "Maya, I'm sorry. I never realized that Mom was treating us so differently. I thought you didn't need as much help as I did. I needed just as much help. I just learned to need it quietly." "That's going to change," Mom said, and there was something that sounded like determination in her voice. "I'm going to do better." But I'd heard promises before. I'd heard good intentions and momentary guilt converted into temporary efforts that faded as soon as the immediate crisis passed. "I hope so, but I'm not going to hold my breath waiting for it to happen." Margaret gathered her purse and stood up. "I should let you all continue this conversation as a family. Maya, do you have everything you need for your recovery?" I nodded, though what I really needed was time to process everything that had just happened. The confrontation I'd been avoiding for years had finally occurred, and while it felt like progress, I wasn't sure yet what kind of progress it was. "Thank you," I told Margaret, "for everything, for showing up, for staying, for helping me find my voice. You already had your voice. You just needed someone to listen to it." After Margaret left, the three of us sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. Emma was still sniffling occasionally, Mom was staring at her hands, and I was trying to figure out what happened next. "So," Emma said eventually, "what can I do to help?" The question surprised me. I expected defensiveness or resentment, not this immediate willingness to be part of the solution.
Maybe just notice things, I said. Notice when I accomplish something or need support. Notice when conversations become all about you and try to include me. Notice when Mom is treating us differently and speak up about it. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Emma nodded seriously. "I can do that. And maybe I can come to some of your literary magazine events. I'd like to hear your writing." "I'd like that too." Mom looked up from her hands. "Maya, I want to understand what you need from me, not just in general terms, but specifically. What would make you feel supported?" It was a fair question, and I realized I needed to be specific, rather than just listing grievances. "Come to my graduation in 3 weeks, not because you have to, but because you want to celebrate my achievements. Ask me about my college plans and actually listen to what I want to study, not what you think I should study. When I tell you about something that happened at school or work, engage with it instead of immediately changing the subject to Emma's activities." What else? "Acknowledge that I exist on social media. Share my achievements the way you share Emma's. And if there's ever another medical emergency, which hopefully there won't be, choose me. Choose being there for me over anything else that's happening." Mom nodded slowly. "Those all seem like reasonable requests." "They're not requests," I said firmly. "They're requirements. For us to have a relationship where I feel valued and respected, these things need to happen consistently, not just when you're feeling guilty about neglecting me." And if they don't happen? It was a question I'd been dreading, because it forced me to confront the logical endpoint of this conversation. What was I prepared to do if nothing changed? What leverage did I actually have? Then I'll finish high school, go to college, and build a life where I'm surrounded by people who see my worth. I won't keep fighting for scraps of attention from people who should love me unconditionally.
The words sounded harsher than I'd intended, but they were true. I was 17 years old, almost an adult, almost free to choose my own relationships and surroundings. I didn't have to accept being treated as secondary forever. Maya, Mom said, and her voice was shaky. I don't want to lose you. Then don't, I said simply. It's entirely up to you. 3 weeks later, I stood at my bedroom window watching Mom load Emma's dance bag into the car for what would normally be an all-day Saturday at the studio. But today was different. Today, Mom was dropping Emma off and coming back home to help me prepare for the scholarship interview that could determine my entire college funding situation. It was a small thing maybe, but it felt revolutionary. Maya, Mom called from downstairs. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Don't you dare try to practice your interview answers on crutches without me here to help you prepare. The protective concern in her voice was something I was still getting used to. For 3 weeks, ever since our confrontation in the living room, Mom had been making deliberate, visible efforts to reshape our family dynamics. Some attempts were clumsy, others felt forced, but the consistency of her effort was undeniable. She'd started by doing exactly what I asked for. She came to my graduation ceremony and sat in the front row, cheering loudly when my name was called for the Academic Excellence Award. She posted about it on Facebook with the same enthusiasm she usually reserved for Emma's achievements. She asked detailed questions about my college plans and actually listened to what I wanted to study, not what she think I should study.
But the changes went deeper than just checking items off a list. Yesterday, when Emma had come home excited about being invited to audition for a summer intensive program, Mom had managed to celebrate Emma's opportunity while also asking about my plans for the summer. When I mentioned that I was hoping to get an internship at the local newspaper, she'd immediately offered to help me research application deadlines and prepare materials. It was like watching someone learn a new language, awkward at first, but gradually becoming more fluent. Emma, for her part, had thrown herself into the role of supportive sister, with the same intensity she brought to her dance training. She'd come to 2 literary magazine readings, asked thoughtful questions about my writing, and even suggested that I submit some of my work to national contests she'd found online. When other family members made their usual dismissive comments about Maya's little hobby, Emma had started correcting them. It's not a hobby, she told our Aunt Carol last weekend. Maya is a published writer. She's won awards. This is her career path, just like dance is mine. The transformation wasn't perfect or complete. Old patterns still surfaced regularly. Mom still had to consciously redirect her attention when she found herself focusing exclusively on Emma's activities. Emma still had to remind herself to ask about my life instead of assuming I'd volunteer information. And I still had to practice actually expressing my needs instead of suffering in silent resentment. But it was progress. Real, measurable, daily progress. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. How are you feeling about the interview today? Remember what we practiced. You belong in that room. Margaret and I had been meeting weekly since my surgery, originally just to discuss practical matters related to my parents' ongoing divorce proceedings, but increasingly to talk about college planning and career goals. She'd helped me prepare for today's scholarship interview with the kind of thorough, detail-oriented support that I'd never experienced from my family. The scholarship was a big one, full tuition plus a stipend for living expenses. And the competition was fierce. Only 12 students from the entire state would be selected, and the interview process was notoriously difficult. But Margaret had helped me understand that I had just as much right to be there as anyone else, that my achievements and potential were worthy of recognition and investment. You have overcome significant obstacles, she had told me during our practice session earlier this week. You have maintained academic excellence while working part-time, while managing family dysfunction, while essentially raising yourself emotionally. Those aren't limitations. They're demonstrations of remarkable resilience and capability. I heard Mom's car in the driveway and went downstairs to meet her. She came in carrying coffee and the kind of focused energy that I associated with Emma's competition days, the maternal intensity of someone preparing their child for an important performance. Okay, she said, setting down her purse and immediately switching into organizational mode. Let's go over your materials one more time. Interview questions, portfolio samples, resume, letters of recommendation. Mom, I interrupted gently, we've reviewed everything 3 times. I'm prepared. I know. I just want to make sure. She paused,
studying my face with the kind of attention she usually reserved for checking Emma's costume details. "You seem nervous." "I am nervous, but that's normal." "Do you want to practice your answers again?" It was a genuine offer, not the distracted half attention I was used to receiving. Mom had cleared her entire morning schedule to focus on my interview preparation, the same way she cleared time for Emma's important events.
Actually, yes, I said. The question about overcoming challenges always trips me up. We spent the next hour in what felt like the most focused conversation we'd had in years. Mom asked thoughtful follow-up questions, offered suggestions for strengthening my examples, and helped me practice maintaining confident body language. When I mentioned feeling guilty about discussing my family situation as a challenge I'd overcome, she surprised me with her response. "Maya, our family dynamics haven't always been healthy or fair. You have every right to talk about how you've handled those difficulties. In fact, I'm proud of how you've handled them." The words hit me unexpectedly hard. When was the last time Mom had said she was proud of me for something other than being responsible or low maintenance? "You're proud of me for dealing with being neglected?" I asked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "I'm proud of you for advocating for yourself, for refusing to accept being treated as less important, for forcing me to confront my own failures as a parent." She sat down beside me on the couch, in the same spot where we'd had our confrontation 3 weeks ago. "Maya, I know I've made terrible mistakes. I know I've hurt you in ways that can't be undone. But watching you stand up for yourself, watching you demand better treatment, that showed me the kind of person you've become despite my failures, not because of my guidance." I stared at her, trying to process this level of self-awareness and accountability. The old Mom would have deflected responsibility, would have found ways to justify her choices or minimize their impact. "You're really changing," I said. "I'm trying to. Margaret helped me understand some things about family systems and attention dynamics that I hadn't considered before." Mom looked embarrassed. I asked her if she'd be willing to meet with me, separately, not related to the divorce proceedings, to help me understand how to be a better parent to both you and Emma. This was news to me. Margaret agreed to that? She recommended a family therapist, actually, someone who specializes in helping parents address favoritism and attention disparities. I have an appointment next week. The idea of my mother in therapy, specifically to address her treatment of me, felt surreal. For years, I'd assumed that the family dynamics were simply fixed, that people didn't change their fundamental approaches to relationships. What made you decide to do that? Mom was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "The night of your surgery, after you were asleep, I sat in my car outside the hospital for almost an hour. I kept thinking about what Margaret had said about emotional neglect, about how responsible children often become responsible as a survival mechanism, rather than a personality trait." She paused, looking down at her hands. "And I realized that I didn't actually know who you were as a person. I knew you were responsible and independent and academically successful, but I didn't know what made you laugh or what kept you up at night or what you dreamed about for your future. I had turned you into a function in our family, the reliable one, the one who didn't need anything, instead of seeing you as a full human being with needs and feelings and potential." The admission was more profound than any apology could have been. I started paying attention to how I talked about you compared to how I talked about Emma. I realized that I described Emma in terms of her talents, her personality, Goals, her emotions. But I described you in terms of your usefulness, how responsible you were, how you didn't cause problems, how you made my life easier. "That's a pretty accurate assessment," I said quietly. "It's horrible. I turned my own daughter into a supporting character in the family story instead of recognizing that you deserve to be the protagonist of your own story."
The metaphor was particularly apt, given my love of literature, and I wondered if she'd chosen it deliberately. "So, what happens now?" I asked. "Now, I learn how to see you fully, how to support your goals the way I support Emma's, how to make up for lost time without expecting you to just forget everything that happened before." It sounded good in theory, but I'd learned to be cautious about promises that required sustained behavior change. "Mom, I need you to understand something," I said carefully. "I want our relationship to improve, but I'm not going to pretend that the past 17 years didn't happen. I'm not going to act grateful for basic parental attention that I should have been receiving all along. I wouldn't ask you to. And I'm not going to prioritize rebuilding our relationship over protecting myself. If you slip back into old patterns, if Emma's needs start taking precedence over mine again, I'm going to call it out immediately. I'm not going to suffer silently anymore." "Good," Mom said firmly. "I want you to call it out. I want you to hold me accountable." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our dynamic. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was talking to my mother as an equal, rather than as a child competing for attention. My phone rang, interrupting the moment. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. "Maya," she said when I answered, "I'm calling with some unexpected news. The scholarship committee just contacted me. They want to move your interview earlier. Instead of this afternoon, they'd like to see you at 11 o'clock this morning. Are you available?" I glanced at the clock. It was 9:30, which meant I had an hour and a half to get to the university campus across town. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I'm ready." "I'll pick you up in 15 minutes, Mom said as soon as I hung up the phone. The drive to campus was surprisingly relaxed. Instead of the nervous chatter I had expected, Mom played my favorite music and let me mentally prepare in comfortable silence. When we arrived at the scholarship office, she walked with me to the building entrance, carrying my portfolio bag and offering quiet words of encouragement. "You belong here," she said, echoing Margaret's words. "You've earned this opportunity through your own hard work and talent." The interview waiting room contained 11 other students, all looking polished and nervous in their formal attire. I recognized a few of them from academic competitions and regional awards ceremonies, the kind of high-achieving students who appeared in newspaper articles about academic excellence. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel intimidated by their presence. Margaret's coaching had helped me understand that my achievements were just as valid as theirs, that my path to this moment had required just as much dedication and resilience as whatever paths had brought them here. Margaret Chen, a woman in a professional suit, appeared at the waiting room door. The interview panel consisted of 3 people: an admissions officer, a representative from the Scholarship Foundation, and a journalism professor who would potentially become my academic advisor. They were seated at a polished conference table in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the campus quad. "Please have a seat," the admissions officer said, gesturing toward a chair across from them. "We've reviewed your application materials, and we're very impressed with your academic record and extracurricular achievements." The journalism professor leaned forward slightly. "Your writing samples, in particular, demonstrate a level of maturity and insight that's unusual for someone your age. Can you tell us about your development as a writer?" It was the opening I'd hoped for, and I launched into the narrative I'd practiced with Margaret and Mom. I talked about discovering my love of storytelling through the books that had provided escape during difficult family periods. I described how working at the library had exposed me to diverse voices and perspectives that shaped my understanding of how stories could illuminate truth and create empathy. I've learned that writing isn't just about arranging words on a page. It's about bearing witness to experiences that might otherwise be invisible, about giving voice to people and situations that are often overlooked. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Covering my academic goals, extracurricular interests, and plans for contributing to campus life. But as we talked, I realized that something had shifted in how I was presenting myself. Instead of minimizing my achievements or apologizing for taking up space, I was speaking with confidence about my potential and worth. When the interview concluded, the journalism professor stood up and shook my hand. Maya, you have a compelling story and clear goals. Regardless of the scholarship outcome, I hope you'll consider our journalism program. We could use more students with your perspective and determination. The comment filled me with a sense of validation that had nothing to do with family dynamics or competition with my sister. This was about my own merit, my own potential, my own value as an individual. Mom was waiting in the campus coffee shop when I emerged from the interview, and her face lit up when she saw me. "How did it do?" she asked immediately. "Really well," I said and meant it. I felt prepared, and I think I represented myself honestly. "I'm so proud of you," she said, pulling me into a hug. "Not just for how you handled the interview, but for everything you've accomplished to get to this point." As we drove home, I found myself thinking about how different this experience had been from previous important events in my life. Mom had prioritized my needs, had cleared her schedule to support me, had treated my opportunity as worthy of attention and effort. It was the kind of parental support that Emma had always received, but that I was experiencing for the first time. When we got home, Emma was already back from dance class, and she immediately wanted to hear about the interview. As I recounted the questions and my responses, I watched her face, looking for signs of resentment or jealousy about the attention I was receiving. Instead, I saw genuine excitement and support.
Maya, that's amazing, Emma said when I finished describing the interview. When do you find out if you got it? They said they'd notify everyone within 2 weeks. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed, she said, and I could tell she meant it. That evening, as I sat at my desk working on a story for the literary magazine, I reflected on how much had changed in just 3 weeks. The confrontation that I'd been dreading for years had actually opened the door to the kind of family relationships I'd always wanted, but never thought were possible. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "How did the interview go? I've been thinking about you all day." I called her instead of texting back, wanting to share the full story of how supported I'd felt throughout the process. "Maya, you sound different," she observed after I'd recounted the day's events. "More confident, more secure." "I feel different," I admitted. "For the first time in my life, I feel like my family sees me as a whole person rather than just a function." "How does that feel?" "Scary, honestly. I'm not used to having expectations that people might actually meet. It's easier to expect nothing and be pleasantly surprised than to hope for support and risk being disappointed." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That's a very mature observation, and it's exactly why the changes in your family dynamics need to be sustained over time. Trust is rebuilt through consistent behavior, not just good intentions." "Do you think it will last? The changes, I mean? Do you think Mom will stick with therapy and continue prioritizing both Emma and me equally?" "I think your mother is genuinely motivated to change, and that's a crucial first step. But you're right to be cautious about expecting instant transformation. Old patterns and behavior are deeply ingrained, and changing them requires ongoing conscious effort." "What if she slips back into treating Emma as more important?" "Then you call it out immediately, the way you did 3 weeks ago. You've proven that you're capable of advocating for yourself, and that skill doesn't disappear just because your circumstances improve." After we hung up, I realized that Margaret had given me something even more valuable than emergency contact support during my surgery. She'd shown me what healthy adult relationships looked like. Relationships based on mutual respect, consistent reliability, and genuine interest in each other's well-being. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange suspension of anticipation. I continued working at the library, attended end-of-year literary magazine events, and prepared for high school graduation. But underneath all the normal activities, I was waiting for the scholarship notification that could change the trajectory of my entire future. Mom continued her conscious efforts to balance attention between Emma and me.
She came to my final literary magazine reading of the year and listened with genuine interest as I read a short story about family dynamics that was barely fictionalized. She posted about the event on social media with the same enthusiasm she typically reserved for Emma's performances. Emma, meanwhile, had been accepted to her summer intensive program and was preparing for 6 weeks of advanced training. But instead of the family's entire focus shifting to her upcoming opportunity, conversations about both of our summer plans happened at the dinner table with equal weight and attention. "I'm nervous about being away from home for so long," Emma admitted one evening as we cleaned up after dinner.
"You'll do great," I assured her. "You always rise to the challenge when you're in competitive environments. What about you? Are you nervous about the scholarship decision?" "Terrified," I said honestly, "but also excited. Either way, I know I'll find a way to make college work. This would just make it easier." "You deserve it," Emma said firmly. "You've worked harder than anyone I know." The comment struck me as particularly meaningful because it came from Emma, who understood better than most what hard work and dedication looked like. On a Thursday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after my interview, I was shelving books in the library's young adult section when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the area code made my heart rate spike. "Maya Chen?" The voice was professional and slightly formal. "Yes, this is Maya." "This is Dr. Patricia Williams from the State Merit Scholarship Foundation. I'm calling with news about your scholarship application." I gripped the phone tighter, my other hand clutching a book about overcoming adversity that suddenly seemed ironically appropriate. "Maya, I'm pleased to inform you that you've been selected as one of our 12 scholarship recipients for the upcoming academic year." The words seemed to echo in my head as if they were coming from very far away. I'd won. Out of hundreds of applicants, I'd been chosen for full tuition and living expenses for 4 years of college. "Maya? Are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here. I'm just processing." Dr. Williams laughed kindly. "It's overwhelming news, I'm sure. You should be very proud of yourself. The selection committee was particularly impressed with your interview and your potential for making a meaningful impact in journalism." After she finished explaining the next steps and paperwork requirements, I hung up and stood in the middle of the library stacks, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. This scholarship didn't just mean I could afford college, it meant I could pursue my actual dreams without compromising due to financial constraints. I called Mom first, my hands shaking as I dialed. "Maya? What's wrong? You sound strange." "Nothing's wrong. I got the scholarship." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom? I'm here," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "Maya, that's incredible. I'm so proud of you. Can you pick me up from work? I want to tell everyone in person. I'm already in the car."
When I got home, Mom had called Emma back from dance class early and set up what she called a celebration planning session at the kitchen table. There were flowers from the grocery store, a cake from the bakery, and a bottle of sparkling cider. "This is what we should have done for every one of your achievements over the years," Mom said as she hugged me. "This is how proud I should have been, how much I should have celebrated your success." Emma threw her arms around both of us. "Maya, this is amazing! You're going to be an incredible journalist!" The afternoon that followed was unlike any celebration I had experienced in our family. Instead of feeling like an afterthought or a brief interruption to Emma's activities, I felt like the center of attention in the best possible way. Mom called relatives to share the news, posted on social media about my achievement, and spent hours asking detailed questions about my college plans. When Margaret arrived for dinner, Mom had insisted on inviting her to celebrate. She brought a small wrapped gift and a card. "I wanted to give you something to commemorate this achievement," she said, as I unwrapped a beautiful leather-bound journal, "for capturing all the stories you're going to tell." Inside the cover, she had written, "To Maya, who found her voice and learned to use it. I can't wait to read the stories you'll write about the world." That evening, as our extended celebration finally wound down,
I found myself sitting on the front porch steps. The same steps where I'd fallen and broken my leg, starting the chain of events that led to this moment. The broken railing had finally been repaired, and the steps felt solid and safe beneath me. Emma came outside and sat down beside me. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you glad that everything happened the way it did? Like, would you change anything if you could go back?" It was a thoughtful question, the kind that Emma had started asking more frequently as she began to understand the complexities of our family dynamics. "I'm glad that I learned to advocate for myself," I said after thinking about it. "I'm glad that I developed resilience and independence, but I wish I hadn't had to learn those things because I was being neglected. I wish I'd learned them while also feeling loved and supported." "Do you think Mom really understands how much she hurt you?" "I think she's starting to, and I think she's genuinely committed to doing better." "What about me? Do you think I understand?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw someone who was grappling with the realization that her childhood had been fundamentally different from mine, despite our shared environment. "I think you're learning," I said, "and I think the fact that you're asking these questions shows that you care about being a better sister. I want to be. I want us to have the kind of relationship where we support each other equally. We're getting there. It takes time to unlearn old patterns." A few days later, I received a call that surprised me more than the scholarship notification had. It was from Dr. Sarah Chen, the journalism professor who had been on my interview panel. "Maya," she said, "I have a proposition for you. We have a paid internship position available at the university newspaper this summer. It would involve covering local community stories and learning about investigative reporting techniques. Are you interested?" The opportunity was exactly the kind of professional development that Margaret and I had discussed as being crucial for building my career foundation. "I'm very interested, but I should mention that I'm still finishing high school. I don't graduate until next week."
That's not a problem. We've worked with exceptional high school students before. Your interview demonstrated exactly the kind of curiosity and insight we're looking for. When I told my family about the internship opportunity, Mom's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "That's perfect! It's such a great way to start building your professional network." Emma was equally excited. "Maya, you're going to be a real journalist this summer. You have to write about interesting people and let me read your articles." But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Margaret when I called to share the news. "Maya, do you realize what's happening here? You advocated for yourself during a family crisis, which led to improved relationships and increased support. That support enabled you to interview confidently for a major scholarship, which you won on your own merit. And now, because of your demonstrated capabilities, you're being offered professional opportunities that will further your career goals." "It sounds like you're saying I created my own success," I said. "I'm saying you learn to recognize your own worth and insist that others recognize it too. That's a skill that will serve you well in journalism and in life." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Margaret was right. The chain of events that had started with my mother choosing Emma's dance recital over my surgery had ultimately led to me choosing myself, my own needs, my own voice, my own future. The broken railing that had caused my initial injury had been a metaphor I hadn't recognized at the time. Our family structure had been just as unstable, just as dangerous, just as in need of repair. And like a broken railing, family relationships couldn't be repaired with just new hardware and fresh paint. They required ongoing attention, conscious effort, and a willingness to acknowledge past failures while working toward better patterns. On graduation day, as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I looked out at the audience and saw Mom, Emma, and Margaret all sitting together in the front row. Mom was taking pictures with the same enthusiasm she'd always shown for Emma's performances. Emma was cheering as loudly as she would for her own achievements, and Margaret was smiling with the kind of pride that comes from watching someone you care about reach their potential. For the first time in my life, I felt completely seen, completely valued, completely supported by the people who mattered most to me. The broken places in our family hadn't just been repaired,
They'd been rebuilt stronger than they'd ever been before. 6 months later, I stood in the newsroom of the university newspaper, staring at my first bylined article in print. The story was about a local foster teenager who had aged out of the system and was working 3 jobs while finishing her GED, a piece that had taken weeks of careful reporting and had required me to navigate complex ethical considerations about privacy and consent. "Maya," Dr. Chen called from her office doorway. "Can you come in here for a minute?" I'd been working as both a summer intern and now a part-time reporter during my freshman year, splitting my time between classes and the kind of hands-on journalism experience that most students didn't access until their junior year. The arrangement had been incredibly demanding, but also invaluable for developing my skills and professional confidence.
Your foster system piece is getting picked up by the state newspaper, Dr. Chen announced as I entered her office. They want to run it in their Sunday investigative section. The news hit me like a small earthquake. Having my work published in a major newspaper as a college freshman was the kind of opportunity that could establish credibility for years to come. They also want to know if you'd be interested in writing a follow-up piece about policy recommendations for improving transition services for aged-out foster youth. I accepted immediately, my mind already racing with potential sources and research approaches. This was exactly the kind of advocacy journalism that had drawn me to the field, using reporting to shed light on systemic problems and potentially influence positive change. When I called home that evening to share the news, Mom answered on the first ring. "Maya, perfect timing. I was just posting about your article on Facebook. Mrs. Henderson from next door said she read it and was so moved that she's looking into becoming a foster parent herself." It was still startling to hear Mom talk about my work with genuine pride and enthusiasm. Over the past 6 months, she'd maintained her commitment to treating my achievements with the same level of attention and celebration that she'd always given Emma's. The consistency of her effort had gradually rebuilt my trust in her support. "That's incredible about Mrs. Henderson," I said. "Direct impact from reporting is exactly what I hope to achieve." "Emma wants to talk to you too," Mom said. "She has some news of her own." When Emma got on the phone, her voice was bubbling with excitement. "Maya, guess what? I got accepted to the pre-professional program at the Metropolitan Ballet Academy." The program Emma was describing was incredibly prestigious, a pathway that could lead directly to professional dance careers with major companies. It was everything she'd been working toward for years. "Emma, that's amazing. When do you start?" "Next fall, but here's the thing. It's in New York, and it's a full-time commitment. I'd have to finish high school through an accelerated program and basically dedicate everything to dance training." I could hear the mixture of excitement and uncertainty in her voice. This opportunity represented the culmination of all her hard work, but it also meant making adult decisions about her future at only 16 years old. "How are you feeling about it?" I asked. "Scared and excited and overwhelmed, but mostly excited. This is what I've been dreaming about since I was 8 years old." "Then you should absolutely do it." "Really? You don't think I'm too young to move to New York?" The question surprised me. When had Emma started asking for my opinion about major life decisions? "I think you're mature enough to handle the challenges and talented enough to succeed," I said honestly. "But more importantly, you've put in the work to earn this opportunity. You should trust yourself to make the most of it." After we hung up, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with Emma. Emma over the past 6 months. Instead of feeling competitive or resentful about her success, I felt genuinely happy for her achievements. When love and attention weren't scarce resources in our family, celebrating Emma's accomplishments didn't diminish my own worth. The changes in our family dynamics had created space for Emma and me to develop a real friendship, rather than just being siblings who happened to live in the same house. We talked regularly about our respective careers, supported each other through challenges, and had learned to see each other as whole people rather than just competitors for parental attention. A few weeks later, Margaret and I met for our monthly dinner at a small Italian restaurant near campus. These dinners had become one of my favorite traditions.
a chance to catch up on life developments and continue the mentoring relationship that had evolved from our original legal connection. "I have some news," Margaret said, as we settled into our usual corner booth. "Your parents' divorce was finalized yesterday." The news was both expected and oddly anticlimactic. My parents had been living separately for over a year, and the legal process had been drawn out by complicated asset division and custody arrangements. "How is everyone handling it?" I asked. "Your mother seems relieved, actually. I think the formal conclusion gives everyone permission to move forward with their separate lives." "What about custody arrangements for Emma?" "Emma will live primarily with your mother, but she'll spend summers and some holidays with your father. Given that she'll be in New York for most of the year anyway, the practical impact is minimal." It occurred to me that the timing of Emma's acceptance to the ballet program was probably not coincidental. Our family's major transitions were all happening simultaneously. The divorce, Emma's career launch, my college progression. It was as if we were all finally ready to become the people we were meant to be, rather than the roles we'd been trapped in by dysfunctional family dynamics. "How do you feel about your parents being officially divorced?" Margaret asked. Honestly, relieved, too. The conflict and tension were worse than the actual separation. At least now, everyone can stop pretending that the marriage was salvageable. "And how are things with your mother now that you've had some time to establish new patterns?" It was a question Margaret asked regularly, and I appreciated her ongoing interest in monitoring the sustainability of our improved relationship. "Good, mostly. She still has to consciously work at treating Emma and me equally, but the effort is consistent. And when she does slip into old patterns, she's receptive to feedback instead of getting defensive. That's significant progress." The biggest change is that I actually tell her things now. About my classes, my work, my social life. I'm not constantly editing myself to avoid taking up too much attention. Margaret smiled. "That must feel like a profound shift after years of minimizing your own needs." Over dinner, I told her about the newspaper pickup of my foster system article and the follow-up assignment I'd been offered. Margaret listened with the kind of focused attention that had taught me what genuine interest in someone else's life looked like. "Maya, you're building exactly the kind of career foundation that will give you choices and independence throughout your professional life. You're establishing credibility early, developing expertise in important social justice issues, and learning to navigate complex institutional systems."
"I keep thinking about that night in the hospital when you stayed with me during surgery," I said. "That was the first time I realized that I deserved to have someone prioritize my well-being." "You always deserved that. You just needed to learn to expect it and insist on it. Do you think I would have learned those lessons eventually without the family crisis?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Maybe, but crisis often accelerates growth that might have taken years to develop otherwise. Your family dynamics were already problematic. The surgery situation just forced everyone to confront patterns that had been causing harm for a long time." After dinner, as Margaret drove me back to campus, I found myself thinking about the ripple effects of that single decision to change my emergency contact. What had started as a moment of defiance and disappointment had ultimately transformed every important relationship in my life. My relationship with Mom had evolved from one-sided support to mutual respect and genuine connection. My relationship with Emma had grown from competitive coexistence to authentic friendship and sisterly support. My relationship with Margaret had developed into a meaningful mentorship that was shaping my professional development and personal growth. But perhaps most importantly, my relationship with myself had fundamentally changed. I'd learned to recognize my own worth, to advocate for my own needs, and to expect the kind of treatment that I'd always deserved, but never believed I could demand. Spring semester brought new challenges and opportunities. I was selected for an advanced reporting seminar, typically reserved for upperclassmen, and I began working on a long-term investigative project about educational inequality in rural school districts. The work was demanding and often frustrating, but it felt like exactly the kind of journalism that could make a meaningful difference in people's lives. Emma's transition to New York had gone smoother than any of us had expected.
She was thriving in the intensive training environment and had already been featured in a regional dance magazine as one of the program's most promising new students. When she called home each week, her excitement about her training was infectious. "Maya, you should come visit me in the city sometime," she said during one of our regular phone conversations. "I want to show you the studio where I'm training, and there are some incredible bookstores and literary events you'd love." The invitation was casual, but meaningful, evidence that Emma saw me as someone worth spending time with beyond our shared family obligations. "I'd love that," I said. "Maybe during spring break?" "Perfect! I'll plan a whole literary tour of the city for you." Mom's progress in therapy had continued throughout the year, and the changes in her behavior had become less conscious and more naturally integrated. She'd learned to recognize her tendency to focus intensely on one child's activities while neglecting the other, and she'd developed strategies for maintaining awareness of both Emma's and my needs simultaneously. When she visited campus for Parents' Weekend, she asked thoughtful questions about my classes and career goals, attended the journalism department's presentation about student publications, and introduced herself to my professors with genuine interest in my academic progress. "I'm so proud of the young woman you've become," she told me as we walked across campus together. "Not just your achievements, but your character. Your willingness to stand up for yourself, your commitment to using your talents to help others, your ability to build meaningful relationships." "I learned most of those things by necessity," I pointed out.
Maybe, but you could have learned cynicism and resentment instead. You chose to develop strength and empathy. It was a more nuanced understanding of my development than I would have expected from her a year earlier. That spring, my foster system follow-up article was published in the state newspaper and generated enough attention to prompt a legislative hearing on transition services for aged-out foster youth. I was invited to testify about my reporting findings and to provide recommendations for policy improvements. Sitting in the state capitol building, speaking to lawmakers about systemic changes that could improve young people's lives, I felt like I was finally becoming the kind of journalist I dreamed of being, someone who could use storytelling and investigation to advocate for people who didn't have powerful voices of their own. Margaret came to watch my testimony, and afterward, she took me to dinner to celebrate what she called a milestone in your advocacy career. "This is just the beginning," she said as we sat in a restaurant overlooking the Capitol building. "You're learning to use your skills and platform to address injustice and inequality. That's exactly the kind of journalism the world needs more of." "I keep thinking about how different my life would be if you hadn't agreed to be my emergency contact that day," I said. "Your life would have been different, but I don't think your fundamental character would have changed. You were already someone who stood up for what was right. You just needed to learn to stand up for yourself with the same conviction." As I finished my freshman year and looked ahead to summer internships and continued education, I felt like I was finally living the life I was meant to live, rather than just surviving the circumstances I'd been given. Emma's ballet career was progressing beyond even her most optimistic expectations. Mom had found ways to channel her intense parental investment into supporting both of our goals equally. Dad, while not a central figure in our daily lives, had become more present and engaged during our scheduled visits. But perhaps most significantly, I'd learned that family relationships didn't have to be fixed patterns that you endured. They could be dynamic systems that evolved and improved through honest communication, mutual respect, and sustained effort from all parties involved. The broken places in our family hadn't just been repaired, they'd been rebuilt into something stronger and more functional than what had existed before. 2 years later, the notification email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was editing a particularly challenging piece about housing discrimination in college towns. When I saw the sender, National Student Journalism Association, my heart rate immediately spiked. I'd submitted my investigative series on educational inequality for their annual Excellence Awards, but the competition was fierce,
with entries from journalism students at major universities across the country. Dear Maya Chen, we are pleased to inform you that your investigative series, Left Behind, Rural Education in Crisis, has been selected as the recipient of the National Student Journalism Association's Award for Outstanding Investigative Reporting.
I read the sentence 3 times before it fully sank in. My work, the project I'd spent 18 months researching and developing, had been recognized as the best student investigative reporting in the entire country. The phone call I made was automatic, muscle memory from years of sharing important news with the person who had taught me that my achievements mattered. Maya, Mom answered before the first ring had finished. How's your day going, sweetheart? I won, I said, unable to keep the grin out of my voice. The National Journalism Award for Investigative Reporting. I actually won. The shriek that came through the phone was so loud I had to hold it away from my ear. Maya! Oh my God, this is incredible! Wait, I'm putting you on speaker so your father can hear. Dad was visiting for the week, part of the co-parenting arrangement that had evolved into something surprisingly functional over the past 2 years. Despite the divorce, my parents had learned to celebrate their children's achievements together without the underlying tension that had characterized most of my childhood. Congratulations, Maya. Dad's voice came through the speaker, warm with genuine pride. Your mother's been telling everyone about your investigative series. This recognition is well-deserved. Have you told Emma yet? She's going to be so excited. Emma was in her second year at the Metropolitan Ballet Academy and was currently performing with the company's Corps de Ballet in their spring season. Her career had progressed even faster than anyone had predicted, and she was being considered for soloist roles despite her age. I'll call her next, I said. But I wanted to tell you first. It was a small gesture, but it represented something significant about how our family dynamics had stabilized. I wanted to share my good news with Mom because I knew she would celebrate it genuinely and enthusiastically, not because I was competing for her attention or hoping to be seen as worthy of love. When I called Emma, she answered during a break between rehearsals, slightly breathless and clearly tired. Maya, perfect timing. I just finished the most brutal partnering rehearsal ever. Please tell me you have something good to distract me from my aching feet. I won the National Journalism Award for Investigative Reporting. Are you serious? Maya, that's huge! Wait, let me sit down so I can properly freak out about this. I could hear rustling as she settled somewhere quieter. Okay, tell me everything. What does this mean for your career? Are there scholarships involved? Professional opportunities? Emma's questions demonstrated how much she'd learned about my field over the past 2 years. Just as I had educated myself about dance terminology and ballet career progression to better support her goals, she'd taken the time to understand journalism awards and their professional significance. There's a cash prize, which is nice, but the real value is the credibility and networking opportunities. This kind of recognition opens doors to competitive internships and potentially to job opportunities after graduation. I'm so proud of you, Emma said, and I could hear the sincerity in her voice. You've worked so hard for this, and you deserve every bit of recognition you're getting. After we hung up, I sat in the newsroom for a few minutes, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. This award wasn't just validation of my reporting skills. It was confirmation that the career path I'd chosen could lead to meaningful impact and professional success. Margaret was in court when I tried to call her, so I sent a text with the news. Her response came back within minutes. Proud, but not surprised. Dinner this weekend to celebrate properly. That evening, I video called with my family to share more details about the award and discuss plans for the ceremony in Washington, D.C. Mom had immediately started researching flights and hotels, determined to attend the awards banquet. This is exactly the kind of achievement that deserves family support, she said firmly. I'm not missing this. Emma chimed in from her dorm room in New York. I'm going to see if I can get permission to attend too. The ceremony is on a Saturday, so I might be able to arrange travel around rehearsal schedules.
The conversation that followed about logistics and travel planning and shared excitement felt like the kind of family support I dreamed about during those years of sitting alone at award ceremonies and academic events. But more than that, it felt natural now, not performative or guilt-driven, but genuinely enthusiastic. 5 years later, my byline appeared above the fold on the front page of the Washington Tribune. Investigation exposes systemic corruption in state foster care contracting. The story was the culmination of 8 months of reporting, dozens of interviews, and careful analysis of financial records that revealed how private companies were profiting from vulnerable children while providing substandard care. Within hours of publication, the state attorney general announced an investigation into the contracting practices, and 3 major foster care agencies had been suspended pending review of their operations. I was standing in the Tribune newsroom watching the story gain traction on social media and generate calls for reform when my editor approached with news that would change everything. "Maya, I just got off the phone with the Pulitzer Committee. Your foster care series has been nominated for the Public Service Award." The Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, the most prestigious award in American journalism, recognizing reporting that serves the public interest and potentially drives systemic change. At 24 years old, with only 2 years of professional experience, I was being considered for the highest honor in my field. The phone call I made this time was to Margaret, who had become not just a mentor, but one of my closest friends over the years. "A Pulitzer nomination," she said when I shared the news. "Maya, do you realize what this means? That my reporting might actually change things for kids in the foster system?" "That too, but also that you've become exactly the kind of journalist you told me you wanted to be during that first conversation in the hospital. You're using your voice to advocate for people who don't have powerful advocates of their own." That weekend, my entire family gathered in Washington for what Mom had dubbed a pre-celebration dinner, regardless of whether I ultimately won the award. Emma flew in from San Francisco, where she was now a principal dancer with the ballet company. Her career had continued its meteoric rise, and she'd been featured on magazine covers and in documentary films about young artists reshaping classical dance. Dad drove down from Baltimore, where he'd settled after the divorce, and had rebuilt his life around his work as a social worker, a career change that had surprised all of us, but seemed to bring him genuine satisfaction. Mom arrived with a scrapbook she'd been maintaining of all my published articles, carefully cut out and preserved with the same attention to details she'd once devoted exclusively to Emma's dance programs and reviews. As we sat around the dinner table at a restaurant near the Tribune offices, I looked at the 4 of us and marveled at how different our family had become from what it was 7 years earlier. "I want to propose a toast," Dad said, raising his wine glass, "to Maya, whose courage in demanding better treatment from her family led to all of us becoming better versions of ourselves. And to Emma," I added, "whose success taught us that family members can celebrate each other's achievements without feeling diminished by them. And to Mom," Emma said, "who showed us that people can change fundamental patterns of behavior when they're truly committed to doing better. And to Margaret," Mom concluded, "who demonstrated what unconditional support looks like and taught all of us what we should expect from the people who claim to love us." As we clinked glasses, I thought about the night 7 years earlier when I'd lain in a hospital bed, feeling abandoned and invisible, making the decision to change my emergency contact to a lawyer I barely knew. That single act of self-advocacy had set in motion a chain of events that transformed not just my family relationships, but my entire understanding of what I deserved and what was possible. The Pulitzer ceremony was held 3 months later. I didn't win. The award went to a team of reporters who had exposed corruption in military contracting. But sitting in that auditorium, surrounded by the most accomplished journalists in the country, I felt like I belonged. After the ceremony, Margaret and I walked through the city together, talking about how the evening had felt and what came next in my career.
Do you ever think about that 17-year-old girl who was so desperate for someone to care about her well-being that she listed her parents' divorce attorney as her emergency contact? She asked. Sometimes, she feels like a different person now. She was the same person. She just hadn't learned yet that she was worthy of the kind of care and attention she was craving. What do you think would have happened if you hadn't agreed to be my emergency contact that day? Margaret stopped walking and turned to face me. I think you would have found another way to advocate for yourself. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe the path would have been different, but you are always going to become someone who refused to accept being undervalued. How can you be so sure? Because the courage to make that phone call in the first place came from inside you. I just provided temporary support while you learned to provide it for yourself. 10 years after that night in the hospital, I stood in my own apartment, hanging up the phone after talking to Emma about her upcoming wedding. She'd asked me to be her maid of honor, and we'd spent an hour discussing plans while she was between rehearsals in London, where she now danced with the Royal Ballet. Mom had called earlier to tell me about the foster care reform bill that had passed, citing my investigative series as instrumental in building public support 3 years after my Pulitzer nomination. That story continued to create ripple effects, improving lives for children I'd never meet. Margaret was coming to dinner that evening, a monthly tradition we'd maintained even as our relationship evolved from emergency contact to mentor to chosen family. She'd recently retired from law but had started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped teenagers aging out of foster care navigate legal and educational systems. As I set the table, I thought about that broken 17-year-old who felt invisible in her own home. She couldn't have imagined that her moment of desperate self-advocacy would lead to this: a career built on amplifying overlooked voices, a family that had learned to love without rationing attention, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that standing up for herself had taught her how to stand up for others. The emergency contact I'd changed in that hospital bed had saved more than just my surgery recovery. It had saved my sense of self-worth, my family relationships, and ultimately my ability to help save others through the power of storytelling.
Sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the largest transformations. Sometimes choosing yourself is the first step toward helping others choose themselves too. Sometimes a broken railing leads to building something stronger than what came before. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel